Welcome, Slayer the Alchemist. And on today's episode, I have a special guest with me, Tim Durling. We're here to discuss Night Ranger, and we're here to discuss his most recent Night Ranger book that just came out. It's called Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review that I had the pleasure of contributing some of my thoughts on a couple Night Ranger records. So, Tim, thanks for joining me here and tell us about your new book.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John, for having me on here. Yeah, Night Ranger is a band that I've been a fan of for a very, very long time. I mean, they were probably one of the first, say, harder rock bands I got into when I was, just 9, 10 years old when I first became aware of them. And they've always been sort of a little bit under the radar, I think, compared to other, hard rock bands that had commercial success and had, hit singles. And I think that, they deserve their due. And like, like the other books that I've done, I don't think there's another book on Night Ranger. So I thought I would do one.
So, tell us the format of the book.
So this is a panel book. This is very much like Martin Popoff's album by album books. We've got a group of people. I ask the same questions of them all, and there's a chapter on each of the studio albums, and they give their answers, whether they agree, disagree. Like you said, you're in some of the chapters. This one is actually the biggest, the most content of any book that I've done. This is almost 300 pages. I've got 10 panelists per chapter. So it's a pretty substantial read, and a lot of folks had a lot of cool things to say about these Night Ranger albums. And another reason for doing this is to show that they didn't just stop in the '80s. There was a hiatus, but they kept putting out music, and as of 4 years ago, they put a new album out, and it's been pretty good, pretty consistent. So I wanted to talk about all the albums equally. So the format is basically it's a panel discussion. You can picture a bunch of people sitting around, just all right, we're going to talk about this Night Ranger album and go. That's kind of what it's like.
Yeah, two thoughts. It is funny you mentioned that they do seem to be a band that, like, as I was getting ready to start the video with you, I was thinking about how sometimes they get lumped in as a one-hit wonder
Hmm.
because of Sister Christian, but they're really not. They had a
No.
lot of, like, they're one of those bands that even if you don't really own any of their records, you recognize a lot more of their music than you would probably
Yeah.
think you would, right? So they sort of fall, yet they feel like they're a little bit of a not as popular as you think they are, yet they've had a number of big hits and a lot of success. And I think part of that, and I know me and you talked about this, and I can't remember if we talked about it in the book or if we talked about it just off camera. Uh, they kind of came early. Like when did the first album came out in 82? So they,
82. Yeah.
yeah, they
Yeah.
they were a little before the whole glam hair LA thing. They weren't from LA. They're from what? San
San
Francisco.
Francisco.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're from San Francisco. So they're not from the LA thing. So they're not really in that, but they sort of are because their sound is melodic and everything like that. But they almost have a sound that's still tied into like the late 70s, early 80s kind of melodic rock. They don't really fit in with when you say Rat, Motley Crue, Twisted
Yeah.
Sister. I don't think of them in that same category.
Exactly.
They're
Yeah.
not metal enough. I mean, they have heavy metal aspects to them. The dual lead guitar, Jeff Watson and Brad Gillis. Of course, Brad Gillis has his connection to Ozzy Osbourne. So they kind of have that element. There is like a riffing element to them, but yet they don't fall into, let's say, the Judas Priest or Iron Maiden camp
Right.
either. They sort of occupy this zone. They're not a strictly AOR radio rock band either. They're a little heavier than Billy Squier, for instance, somebody
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
that, right?
Good point. Yep.
But they're not, they're not as heavy as Priest or Maiden or AC/DC or something like that. So I think because of that, it causes them to feel a little underrated, but it also causes them to be liked by, there's metalheads that like Night
Yeah.
Ranger. There's people that don't like metal that like Night Ranger, that all they listened to was radio rock, classic
Yeah.
rock, that type of thing. There's people that are just MTV fans that again don't like heavy metal but they still like Night Ranger. So they have this interesting kind of appeal. And some of it I think is timing, some of it I think is their music, their image, although they embrace the sort of more 80s look at times as the 80s went on. They were never totally over the top with their look or anything like that. So yeah, they're just a sort of this interesting, kind of underlooked and underrated band in some weird way for a band who's had a number of successful albums, sold a lot of records, had a number of high chart hits.
You're absolutely right, John. I mean, you've put it very, very well. They do occupy this sort of unique space. I've always kind of considered them uh, kind of in their own thing because you're right. They aren't strictly hard rock. Like they're not Def Leppard. We're talking about radio friendly hard rock. They're not Def Leppard. They're not Bon Jovi. They're not Whitesnake. But they're not Foreigner, they're not Journey,
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
not REO Speedwagon. You know,
yeah,
they look more like Def Leppard, White Snake, but they're a more polite looking bunch
yeah,
of long haired guys. And you're right, musically, they do seem like something very much out of the late 70s. But the bands that you could kind of compare to them, you know, I'm thinking of stuff maybe that was around at the time. Billy Squire is a good example. You mentioned the kind of stuff Sammy Hagar was doing.
Sam Hagar, yeah.
You know, even the stuff that Jefferson Starship was doing at the turn of the 80s before they became just Starship. Uh, you know, and that radio friendly rock, even oddly enough, sticks. Of course, there's a connection there down years later with Damn Yankees, but you look at Night Ranger and they didn't look like those, they didn't look like a 70s band. You look at them and you think, well, that's an 80s band, even if
Yeah.
you don't know who they are. So they did kind of occupy this unique space as far as their image. And musically, you're absolutely right. They sort of worked inside this melodic rock space. But because they had Brad Gillis, because they had Jeff Watson, there are crazy guitar solos, all kinds of virtuosity throughout their albums. Maybe not necessarily on the singles, but even the singles, there's, you know, guitar players would go crazy trying to learn some of the licks in these songs. Um, I talked to another person I talked to, and was very generous with his time with Sean Kelly from Coney Hatch and Lee Aaron.
Mm.
He's played with Helix and a bunch of different people. We talked about the guitar players in Night Ranger, and he said that before he even heard the song Don't Tell Me You Love Me, he saw it transcribed in a guitar magazine, and his first reaction was, look at all those notes. Um,
Yeah.
so, and you're right, they did have cred with metalheads that bands like this don't normally have. And I think a lot of that was Brad Gillis playing with Ozzy. Once you've been in
Yeah.
Ozzy's band, you've got that cred and it kind of follows you, right? They kind of follow what you do, even though it was a very, very brief period. But they had a mixed. The interesting thing about Night Ranger is that they had this mixed pedigree. Also, they were, you know, even though their first album came out in 82, they were all veterans at this point. They weren't overly old guys. I think the oldest guy might have been 30, but they were still relatively young guys, but they you're right, they weren't 22 like a lot of the Sunset Strip bands. They weren't just young guys. They'd been around. Jack and Brad and eventually Kelly were all in a band called Rubicon, which sounds nothing like Night Ranger.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, Alan Fitzgerald, their keyboard player, he was in Montrose. He was in, and then from there he went on to Sammy Hagar's solo band for several years. So he's, I think, a bit older than the rest of those guys. Jeff Watson, I've never been too sure what Jeff did before. You know, I don't think he was in a recording band or a major label band before Night Ranger, but whatever it is that brought them together, I think they're the product of those influences. But they definitely, at their core, I would call them a hard rock band. It's just that the melodic sense, uh, you know, even on a song that's quote unquote heavy, their melodic sense never falters. And yet, what I love about them is that it never sounds forced and it never sounds wimpy and it never sounds like they were sort of under the gun from the record label to write poppy rock songs. I think they just liked writing this way.
Yeah.
Really, the only time that they came across like record company pressure is the fact, and this happens to a lot of bands, when your biggest hit is a ballad.
Yeah. They want
Well,
more
that's
of
all the
that.
label wants. But a one hit wonder is not accurate when you're talking about Night Ranger. And yes, of course, if people know one song by Night Ranger, it's Sister Christian. It was a huge hit all over the world. It's had multiple lives. It's been used in
Hmm.
TV shows and movies. And it's definitely the song that gave them a career. But they had a lot of other hits too. Sentimental Street was a top 10 single. They had top 20 songs like When You Close Your Eyes and Four in the
Hmm.
Morning. So, yeah, and they just have a I don't want to say friendly, but there's something appealing about their sound. It's not too heavy.
Yeah.
And you've got Jack Blades and Kelly Kagi trading lead vocals, both great vocalists. It's not that high tenor vocalist, so it just kind of you just want to listen, and even if you're not sure who it is, like they're the type of band that a younger listener or someone that really wasn't paying attention might catch a song, say on Sirius XM or something, and go, "Oh, I like this. Who is this? I've never heard this before."
Yeah.
But you're right. You can't really directly compare them to another band. There are moments where I say, oh, this particular part in this particular song, this reminds me of this. But for the most part, they've got their own sound. And I think that they influenced a lot of bands that came after them more than they were ever given credit for.
Yeah. And you mentioned it about this melodic sense that they have, and the two great lead vocalists, different, slightly different in style. Kelly has a little bit more of a bluesy, a little bit more dirt on his voice, whereas Jack has more of the tenor style voice. They've got great background vocals, and like you said, they never came across as dangerous or threatening or dark or
Yeah,
anything
they
like
weren't they
that.
weren't bad boys, so to
Exactly.
speak. I
Right,
mean,
right, right.
whatever it is, they may have been just as notorious and wild
Right.
as any other band, but that wasn't their public persona. Their pictures, they're always smiling, they're always rather clean
Yeah.
cut. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and they were sort of the masters of, I know we talked about this when we were doing your book, the chapters that I was in, how I love their ballads, and I love when they do that whole nostalgia feeling. Like we talked
Yeah,
about When You Close Your Eyes,
great example. Yeah,
remember when we were young, remember
yeah.
when we were in love,
Yeah.
remember when, and the video for that song is just that perfect
It's
example.
pretty literal, yeah. And Jack Blades is a great songwriter and he's a great
Yeah,
storyteller. He writes the majority of the lyrics and he weaves these little tales that you can just kind of play the little mini movie in your
yeah,
mind. He'll mention place names and he'll put you in a situation and but without doing a lot of exposition and saying, "Hey, I'm about to sing a song about something that happened 20 years ago." He just starts in singing, and then you're just there. You're just, and it might remind you of something that happened to you. It might not, but either way, there's a very cinematic feel to a lot of his lyrics. And another thing about this band is that it's a unique presentation for a band. What I mean by that is that you've got your two singers in the band are the rhythm section, the bassist and the drummer.
yeah,
Like that's unusual. So then
yeah,
you've got your two guitarists and a keyboard player, but there's no one front man. Everybody's playing an instrument. Uh, that makes them a little bit different too. But I mean, Jack's kind of the front man. He's out front,
yeah.
interacting with the crowd more than anyone else. But it just works. It just works for them. It's just that I wish that you know, I think that they should have had a longer run of gold and platinum albums than they did. But, like a lot of bands, the turn of the 90s was, in Night Ranger's case, they broke up by 89. So you can't really blame the grunge thing
Right.
for breaking Night Ranger up. It was more of a, record company pressure wanting another hit ballad and another hit ballad and another hit ballad. But when they got back together, it took them a while, but eventually, and I think it started with the album Somewhere in California, they were did what I think very few bands are able to do. They truly recaptured their classic sound without just Xeroxing it
Right.
and making it sound like they're rewriting older songs in a different key with different words. There's just they've captured what they do so well, and they've been on a roll. I mean, I hope they do another album at least. As the way that they've been going, they're due in 2025 for a new record because it's been 4 years since the last one, and it was 4 years before the last one.
Yeah.
Uh, so we'll see. But I don't know if I answered your question or not. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that you might dismiss them as being just another band from the 80s, but I think there's a lot of things that make them unique and make them stand out. And I think people need to realize that, they're not just good, they're really good.
Yeah. And even preparing for the sections in the book that I was interviewed on, I mean, honestly, hadn't paid attention to Night Ranger, and I'm gonna guess that there's people my age that it was the same thing. And we talked about this also, that it was Man in Motion and the secret to my success. And that song sort of turned me off from them, and I didn't pay attention to them again after that. And when I'm getting ready to do some of the later records, uh, listening to them, I was what you just said about how they're able to still sound like Night Ranger without sound like they're trying to just copy themselves from days of old. And I think because it all comes back to these guys are just really good songwriters. And I know we talked about Man in Motion. Uh, was that a video on my channel or your channel? We did
We
Man
we
in
talked
Motion.
about I've been in the midst of doing this deep dive series, and I think you and I did Big Life, but as far
Oh, Big
as
Life. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right. We did Big Life.
but as far as the chapters that you're in, um, let's see now.
I did Big
I
Life. I
You
did the
did
last
Seven
record
Wishes. Yeah,
and
you did
Somewhere in California, I think.
Yeah, you did Seven Wishes, and you did ATBPO, which is their
Mhm.
most recent. And yeah, I think you did. You'd think I would know, wouldn't you? Yeah, you did Somewhere in California.
Yeah.
Somewhere in California that's from 2011, and that was the first album that they really kind of came back as even though they'd reunited years earlier. To me, that album you could put alongside any of those 80s albums, and unsuspecting listeners would not know it was that much more recent. But you're right. I mean, you're at what you're saying as far as when you tuned out. Well, that was when the public at large did, because
Hmm.
Midnight Madness had Sister Christian, it had When You Close Your Eyes, and it had You Can Still Rock in America. It sold 1 million copies. It did very well. Seven Wishes came out. It sold 1 million. It had 3 top 20 singles, and then they put out Big Life, and they kind of put all their hopes that the secret
Hmm.
of my success would be this big movie soundtrack hit. And that's a very rare example of a song that was sort of made to order. Like
Yeah.
they were given the title of the movie and they say, write us a theme song.
Yeah.
And so yeah, Big Life faltered. It went gold. Man in Motion didn't certify at all. And that was kind of it. And I think to a lot of people, they think that, okay, well, they're out there touring, but they're just doing, the stuff in the 80s. And what most people don't realize is that they've released, you know, there's 13 studio albums altogether, so they've been pretty prolific. Even though they were on hiatus, and even though they went a decade without any new albums between '98 and 2007, they've been kept putting out new music. Where a lot of bands, a lot of these, what they call heritage acts, have
Hmm.
just stopped making new music,
Yeah.
like Foreigner, and they
Yeah.
just tore the catalog to death. So I think that was worth mentioning. But yeah, I'd love for people to revisit, or in some cases visit for the first time, those more recent albums and say, hey, this may not have, a major label attached to it, but just listen to it and tell me if it doesn't stand up to what what your best memories of what you remember of Night Ranger.
All right. So let's say you've got somebody out there, a hard rocker, a metalhead, roughly our age. They only know their 80s stuff. What do you recommend? What's the one album from after the 80s that you would say for a person to check out first?
Oh, Somewhere in California, absolutely. If they know anything at all about Night Ranger, this is not going to throw them for a loop. It's not like they got super heavy. and it's not like they changed their sound up. I would say listen to Somewhere in California, and not only the songwriting and stuff, but how well Jack Blades and Kelly Keagy both still sing, and they both
Hmm.
still sing really well live too.
Hmm.
Which is, I mean, that's the first thing to go, right? Is the
Yeah, yeah,
vocalist. But I
yeah.
think it has something to do with the fact that I alluded to this before. Night Ranger never wrote songs in those really, really high keys.
Right,
You know, like not like Journey or even Survivor or a band like that or Boston. So the singers, as they get older, they can still kind of handle the stuff that they did when they were in their 20s and 30s. And I think there's something to be said for that. And it's not like, it's not like they were singing all baritone, you
right,
know. It's just a different thing. It wasn't all high tenor stuff all the time.
right.
Um, and I think that has a lot to do with their longevity as well, because they've, when you as a singer, if you burn out, then you got to find a replacement, and that's the hardest thing to do. But in the case of Night Ranger, it's even harder because your singers are also players,
Yeah.
musicians. So, but I would say Somewhere in California, that's a good all-purpose, all-around answer because, even though it's 14 years ago, it's still a latter-day album. Let's be
Hmm.
real. I would say start there.
What's your least favorite album in the Night Ranger catalog?
Uh, Without a doubt, Hole in the Sun. That's the album that they put out in 2007. It was their last album with Jeff Watson. It was their first album in 9 years. And to me, it doesn't sound like Night Ranger. It's angry, it's unfocused, it's all over the place stylistically. They don't know whether they want to be power pop or sort of the rock that was happening in the early 2000s. It's very unfocused. The songs, for the most part, are I think my personal opinion are quite unmemorable. Now, it's interesting because a lot of people I think if you ask enough diehard Night Ranger fans of all the albums, the ones that know all the albums, they'll probably say Hole in the Sun simply because something has to come in last. That doesn't mean it doesn't have its moments, but
Hmm.
I describe that album as a personality crisis because it doesn't sound like Night Ranger. One of the things that the Night Ranger are known for, and one of the things that I like about them is that there's always this positive, upbeat. The lyrics are encouraging and they're a lot of their songs could be described as anthemic. Uh, and Hole in the Sun, it's pessimistic, it's cynical. It just, bands can change and evolve, and sometimes it works, but this is a case where it doesn't feel like their hearts were in it. And I think you had interband fighting had a lot to do with it too. It sounds like the five musicians were never in the same room at the same time.
Yeah.
But because Somewhere in California followed it, I think they had to get it out of their system, in a bent into a way other musical dimension. It's their Saint anger. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
they had to get it out of their system to
Yeah.
to to regroup and refocus.
And it was a big gap between Seven, which came out in 98, and Hole in the Sun, which came out in 2007. That's a 9 year gap. And when you look at Dawn Patrol came out in 82 and Man in Motion, their last 80s record, came out in 88. That's a 6 year gap. I often
Yeah.
say that time moved at a different speed in the 70s, in the 80s. It's
Yeah.
you sometimes forget this. Like 6 years, Dawn Patrol to Man in Motion, their 80s catalog, 6 years. In this current climate, it's not uncommon for bands. It's usually like 4, 5, 6 years between records. I mean, that was
if
the span
if
of like,
they're going to do one,
yeah,
that's the frustrating thing. But I understand because records don't sell like they used to. Before,
yeah,
you signed a record contract and the record label, gave you money to tour and they gave you money for
yeah,
promotion or whatever, and they said you
yeah.
owe us an album a year or every 2 years. So they were pretty prolific during that period. But yeah, I never really thought about that before. But in the whole time span between Dawn Patrol and Man in Motion, they didn't even do an album, and then there's 3 more years onto that gap. So,
Hmm.
and I think
Yeah.
another thing that, and we talk about this as we go through each of the chapters. So obviously, the band breaks up in '89. Jack Blades gets really lucky and finds success again in Damn Yankees with Tommy Shaw and Ted Nugent and Michael Cardello. They put out a debut album in 1990 that's, I think, double platinum. They have a top three. They have a number three hit with High Enough. So it kind of, for him, it must have felt like a huge victory. Like,
Hmm.
wow, how many people are lucky enough to do that twice? And the second album, Don't Tread. Now here's where grunge starts to affect things. That only went gold, didn't do quite as well. And Ted Nugent went back to his career, and then Jack and Tommy Shaw, by this time, had formed they turned out to be very simpatico as far as the way that their voices blended together.
Yeah.
Jack, it's weird because Jack and Kelly sound great singing together, and Jack and Tommy sound great singing together.
Yeah.
Uh, they became a pretty prolific songwriting duo. I mean, they wrote songs for Aerosmith, for Alice Cooper, for Ozzy Osbourne, bunch of different people, and uh, and so Brad, what happened then, and this is like a dark horse album for them. I happen to like it. Brad Gillis, Kelly Keagy, they get Gary Moon, who is a bassist and vocalist, and they do an album called Feeding Off the Mojo, which is almost never talked about. As a matter of fact, it's not even considered part of the Night Ranger catalog because they put out seven, and technically that's their eighth album. So
Hmm.
it's not even considered part of their catalog. And it's a little bit like the John Corabi album with Motley Crue from '94,
Yeah.
the self-titled one. It really doesn't sound much like Night Ranger, except that in Night Ranger's case, when Kelly sings, it sounds like Night Ranger
Hmm.
because you had two vocalists, right? But it's kind of like that. It's a real outlier album. But the original five did come back together in '96 and they did a couple of albums. They did Neverland and they did Seven, but they didn't automatically, you know, it was great that they were back together. I was excited about it, but it's not like they went right back to where they left off because they'd been that far apart. And like I said, Jack had been writing with all of these different songwriters in all of these different styles. And then that gap between Seven and Hole in the Sun, that's even more pronounced, right? Jack and Kelly did solo albums, and Brad did a solo album, and there's all these different things going on. So there is a thing you can take too long, and the anticipation is never going to be. It's never going to be well. What am I trying to say? At a certain point, you build up so much anticipation that it's never going to live up to that.
Hmm.
But I even think if they'd put it out, in 1999, if they'd have put out Hole in the Sun, I still don't think it would have been very well received.
Yeah. All right. Any final things you want to share about your book before we wrap it up?
I just appreciate everybody's support on this. Very happy with how it came out. Once again, my good friend Matt Phillips from Go North Design did the book design for me. I think it came out great. There's once again, there's pictures from my personal collection in here. Everything in here is from my own collection, the black
Nice.
and white photos, but they translate really well. It's everything you wanted to know about Night Ranger, but it's the story is told by the fans. It's the fans' opinions on these albums, but you do get a sense of here's all the albums, here's the songs on them. So if you want to know where to get going and what kind of albums each of these are, I think that this will do the trick for you.
Awesome. And it's available on Amazon or any fine
It's
bookseller out there.
just Amazon
Oh, just Amazon? Okay.
exclusively, but whatever part of the world you're in, UK, Australia, you can get it through your whatever your local Amazon is.
Awesome. All right. Well, Tim, thank you for joining me here to discuss your new book, Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review. And make sure everybody out there, let us know in the comments what you guys think about Night Ranger in general, maybe what your favorite record is for them. Are you familiar with any of their 90s, 2000s catalog? Let us know down below. Make sure you check out Tim's awesome Night Ranger book, and we'll see you all at the next one.
Thanks, John.